Sophia sat alone on the park bench, her eyes fixed on a world she couldn't hear. The sound of the children's laughter around her went unnoticed by her, like a melody lost in the wind. She could not hear the bird song, nor the rustling of the leaves, nor the distant murmur of the city. All around him was absolute silence, an invisible barrier that separated his existence from the world of other people. She was used to being alone, but that didn't make it any easier. Sometimes she looked at the people around her and wondered what she would be able to feel if she could hear the words, the voices, the sounds of the world. But the sounds were for others, and she was content with what she could see and feel. The touch of the breeze on her face, the soft warmth of the sun on her skin. Beauty was in every detail, but there was a stillness that accompanied it. A deep, lonely emptiness that she didn't know how to fill. But that day, something happened. Her eyes met those of a dog, a simple-looking dog who was watching Sophia with calm curiosity. There was no barking, no noise, just the animal's attentive gaze. He didn't judge her, didn't ask her anything. He was just there with her, silently. It was as if silence was suddenly no longer something to be feared, but something to be shared. Sophia's life, until then marked by distance from sound, began to intertwine with that silent being who did not know how to bark. He did not see her as someone different. He saw her as someone simply. And in that look, something began to change. Something silent but powerful. Something that would make her understand that communication often doesn't need words. Sophia had never known what the sound was. From a very young age, she had become accustomed to a world where words had no form and sounds were just distant, unattainable figures. Her condition separated her from others, and there was no greater pain than the feeling of not being able to truly connect with those around her. The others talked, laughed, argued, but she wasn't part of it. Her parents, who loved her deeply, tried hard to create communication through gestures and looks. But there was always a distance, an invisible line that she could not cross. Sophia grew up learning to deal with the world in a different way. Her perception was focused on visuals, gestures, and expressions of people, but she often felt that these forms of communication were incomplete. She didn't know what it was like to feel completely connected. The weight of her condition made her feel like an outsider, an observer of life, more than a participant. There was an emptiness in her heart, a need to be part of something bigger. She searched for it in the silence, but all she found was the same loneliness. It wasn't that she wasn't grateful for the life she had, but there was always a feeling that something was missing. Something she couldn't name, but felt deeply. The need to find a true connection, something that transcended the limits of her condition, was what distressed her the most. That moment in the park with the dog's silent gaze seemed to be the turning point. Something there in the simple meeting of their eyes made her think that perhaps there was a form of communication that she had not yet known. A language that did not depend on sounds she had never heard, but on something deeper. Something that the dog seemed to want to share. It was a gray morning when the dog first appeared. He wasn't a purebred dog, nor was he particularly pretty, but there was something about his presence that was unmistakable. He walked slowly through the park as if he were lost, not knowing exactly what he was looking for. His eyes, large and expressive, were the only thing that really caught anyone's attention. He seemed to observe the world around him in a different way, calmer, more attentive. He approached Sophia, standing there with the same expression of curiosity that she had. Sophia felt something in his gaze, as if he knew exactly what she felt, as if he knew that somehow he was no different from her. He was silent too. He didn't bark. He didn't make any impulsive movements like the other dogs. He was just silent. But in that silence, Sophia found a peace she had never experienced before, as if time had slowed down around them. She reached out, lightly touching the dog's fur. He didn't flinch, just sat beside her, sharing that moment of stillness. That was when she realized. This dog didn't need barking, loud gestures, or grand displays of affection. He looked at her with a deep understanding, as if he could see her in a way that others couldn't. He didn't see her as deaf, or as someone with a disability. He saw her as Sophie, with all her humanity. And that was more than she had ever imagined. And for the first time, she felt that perhaps verbal language was not necessary to exist in full connection with another. The dog had no words, and neither did she. But together they were creating something stronger, more beautiful. Something that needed no sound, only presence. The following days were like a silent dance between the two. Sophia and the dog, now named Leo, began to understand each other in a unique way. No words were needed, just looks and gestures. He reacted to her movements with impressive precision, as if he were able to interpret even the smallest signals she gave. Every touch, every look between them seemed to deepen this mysterious and silent connection. They were creating a language of their own, a language that did not depend on sounds, but on the deep understanding that only silence could offer. As the months passed, Sophia and Leo's relationship deepened, but not without its challenges. Although the bond that united them was undeniable, there were moments of discomfort, small barriers that appeared between them, as if the outside world were trying to intervene in this silent connection they were creating. Sophia, despite feeling closer to Leo than to anyone else, still carried within her the weight of loneliness. There were times when she wondered if Leo, with his silent innocence, really understood the magnitude of her existence. He was a dog, after all, and she was a human with a complex world of feelings, doubts, and desires. She wondered in moments of vulnerability if it was possible for him to really understand the depth of her pain, of her struggle to be accepted in a world that did not speak her language. Leo, in turn, with his calm demeanor and unconditional presence, seemed to understand this without needing words. He knew when she was sad. He knew when she was lost in her own thoughts. And in every moment of silence, he would approach, touching her hand with his paw, or resting his head gently on her shoulder as if to say, "I'm here. You don't need to say anything. I understand." But the biggest transformation of all was not just in the bond between them, but in the way Sophia began to see herself. Every gesture Leo made, every little sign that he was connected to her, made her feel less invisible. She began to realize that even though words had never been a part of her life, that didn't mean she wasn't capable of communicating in more powerful, deeper ways. What Leo taught him, without knowing it, was that silence could be its own language, as rich and beautiful as any other. At times, however, things weren't so simple. There were the curious looks from other people in the park, the whispers Sophia heard as she walked with Leo, as if the fact that she was deaf was something strange. And then there was the fear, the silent fear she felt that despite everything, the distance between her and the world would still exist. There was the fear that even with Leo, she would still be alone, incomplete. Leo, however, never left. He was there every step of the way, understanding in a way that no words could explain. When she cried silently, he lay down beside her like a pillar of support, offering his warmth and presence. And in one of those moments, a transformation happened. Sophia realized that she was no longer waiting for the world to adapt to her, or for people to understand her perfectly. She began to accept that perhaps her way of being in the world was unique, and that this did not mean that it was wrong or incomplete. On the contrary, it was a way of being present in a profound way, without rushing, without pressure. Like Leo, she did not need words to be seen or to feel that she was finally being understood. The real transformation, she realized, was in accepting what was most simple and pure, the communication of the heart. It didn't matter if the words were not spoken or if the sounds didn't exist in her world. What mattered was the silent bond she had created with Leo, a connection stronger than any sound, truer than any speech. Winter came early that year. Sophia and Leo continued their routine of daily walks through the park, but unlike the calm, sunny days, the intense cold made the atmosphere around them seem quieter. Snow covered the trails, and the trees with their bare branches seemed to watch the world with a heavy stillness. That day, however, something seemed different. Leo was restless, as if something was disturbing him, although it was not possible to clearly perceive what was affecting him. Sophia felt the deep silence that always surrounded them, but there was an invisible tension in the air, something she couldn't name. As they walked along the trails, Leo suddenly stopped, his ears pricked up, and he stared at a point on the horizon. Sophia, confused, tried to catch his attention, but he didn't move. It was as if he was grasping something she couldn't understand. His eyes, usually so calm, were now filled with an urgency that Sophia had never seen before. Not knowing what to do, she just stood by his side, watching him with a growing sense that something was about to happen. Leo looked at her then, and it was as if, in that look, he told her everything she needed to know. He knew something was coming, something she couldn't control. What they shared was about to be challenged in ways neither of them could have anticipated. At that moment, an inexplicable pain took hold of Sophia. It was as if she knew without knowing it that this silent tranquility she had created with Leo could not last forever. Something was approaching, and in her soul she felt that perhaps it was she who needed to let go. But the pain of that possibility was almost unbearable. What came next was a silent blow. Leo, who seemed in good health, began to stagger. Sophie watched him fall softly, his paws shaking. She knelt beside him, her heart racing, a growing panic filling her. Leo looked at her once more, as if to tell her it was okay, as if to tell her not to be afraid. But there was nothing that could be done. Paramedics arrived quickly, but as Leo was taken away on a stretcher, Sophia felt like something had been ripped out of her, something that could not be replaced. She looked up at the gray sky and felt a tear run down her face, a tear she didn't know she could shed. What followed was a profound emptiness, an absence that echoed through every corner of her being. Leo, the dog who had shown her that it was not necessary to speak to be understood, was now far away, and Sophia was once again alone in the world. Yet even in the pain of loss, a silent truth began to form within her. Leo had taught her more than any words could express. He had taught her to believe in the communication of the heart. He had shown her that silence could be the greatest form of connection, stronger than any noise or words. As the snow fell, Sophie somehow knew that Leo's lesson would not die with him. The silent language, which did not depend on sounds, which transcended space and time, was now part of her. She was no longer alone. And while the emptiness of her loss still weighed on her chest, she understood clearly that Leo had prepared her for this new phase of her life. He had shown her what really mattered: genuine connection, the ability to feel deeply without words. Now, with the pain still fresh, she knew she could go on, not because he was by her side, but because he had taught her to live in a fuller, truer, more connected way. Winter has passed, as the seasons always do. The snow melted, and the sky, previously gray and overcast, gave way to the soft blue of spring. But for Sophia, nothing seemed the same anymore. Leo's absence still echoed in every corner of the house. The walks through the park continued, but without him the trails seemed longer and lonelier. However, with every step she took, Sophia felt something different. Something invisible, like a connection that remained somewhere beyond logical understanding. The memory of Leo was no longer just a sharp pain, but a silent presence that somehow still spoke to her through the small moments of everyday life. One sunny morning, while walking along one of the trails in the park where so many memories had been created, Sophia found something she hadn't expected. A small dog with eyes as expressive as Leo's approached her. He seemed lost, without an owner, and his movements were hesitant but curious, as if he sensed that something important was happening. Sophia bent down with a sad but genuine smile, and the dog approached timidly. She stroked his head, feeling the soft touch of his fur, and something deep inside her was ignited. It wasn't the same as it had been with Leo, but there was a flame of understanding, of connection, of something that couldn't be explained in words. The dog, like Leo, seemed to have the ability to communicate silently, through subtle gestures, glances, and the energy that emanated from him. And as she petted him, Sophia felt for the first time since her loss that her life was not incomplete. She had learned the true lesson from Leo. True connection does not need words or grand gestures. It is felt, it is lived, it is breathed, even in the deepest silence. Over time, Sophia adopted the little dog, which she named Sul. He didn't replace Leo, but somehow he brought light back into her heart. They didn't speak the same language, but over the months they began to understand each other. Sul learned to communicate with her in the same way that Leo had done, with gestures and feelings that didn't depend on sounds. On a quiet afternoon, as Sophia sat on a park bench, the sun lying at her feet, she reflected on everything she had experienced. The pain of losing Leo was still there, but it no longer dominated her heart. Now she was grateful for the transformation he had brought into her life. He had taught her to listen with her heart, to perceive the subtleties of life, to connect with what was deepest and truest. Sophia looked up at the sky, and in that moment she felt a silent peace, as if somehow Leo was there with her. Not physically, but in everything she now knew. He had helped her discover the language of love that does not need words, the ability to live fully, even in the most difficult situations. Sul stood up, wagging his tail and looking at her with bright, curious eyes. Sophia smiled, knowing that while each being had their own journey, they were all part of something bigger, an invisible web of connections that transcends time and death. Sometimes the greatest learning comes from those we least expect, and sometimes true transformation comes in the form of a silent look, a subtle gesture, a deep connection that needs no words to exist. "Thank you, Leo," Sophia thought, a tear running down her face. But this tear was no longer of pain. It was of gratitude. Gratitude for the journey, for the friendship, for the love. And as she stood and walked beside Sul, she knew that the most beautiful language in the world was not the one learned with words. It was the one that was felt, lived, shared, and that, even in silence, was never unheard. Leo and Sophia's story didn't end with their farewell. She continued, "If this story touched your heart, just imagine how many more are still to come." Here, every bark carries a new beginning, a second chance, a brand new life. If you believe in the power of dogs to change destinies, like mine, like yours, then subscribe to the channel and leave a like, because together we'll share stories the world needs to hear and feel.